The train lurched. Metal groaned against metal. The oil lamps swung in a slow, hypnotic arc. Shadows danced across Eleanor's sleeping face. I still believed I was the one who had sacrificed everything for this journey. Before the night was over, I would discover I had been terribly wrong. Eleanor would open her eyes and confess that she had heard every word I whispered while I believed she was asleep. She looked like a ghost carved from pale winter stone. The deep hollows beneath her eyes were a map of every hour she had spent tethered to a loom. I remembered the beef tallow. I remembered the heavy, cloying scent of rendered fat filling our kitchen. Eleanor never complained. She would stand over the cauldron. Her face flushed red from the steam. The lie was dangerous. She handled it with the grace of a priestess performing a holy rite. The world tries to turn us into dirt. Arthur, she would say. She would stir the thick, gray sludge with a heavy oak paddle. Our job is to stay clean. She believed in the dignity of a white collar. She believed in the sanctity of a scrubbed floor. Now, her own skin was stained with the indelible ink of the industrial age. The soot of the Lowell mills had settled into the very pores of her hands. I reached out and touched the edge of her sleeve. The fabric was coarse. It was the cheap, mass-produced wool that the poor were forced to wear. It was a bitter irony. She spent her life weaving the finest silks for the Vanderbilts and the Astors. Yet, she dressed in rags that scratched her skin. The blizzard of 1888 didn't care about social standing. Outside the window, the world was a white void. The telegraph lines were down. The great white hurricane had severed New York from the rest of the world. Men were freezing to death in the streets of Manhattan. Firemen couldn't reach burning buildings because the drifts were 10 feet high. But inside this carriage, time had stopped. I looked at her knuckles again. They were swollen and twisted. Years of damp weaving rooms had settled into her joints. I thought of the day I sent her away. The bank had taken the livestock. They had taken the plow. They had taken the very dirt we walked on. The panic of 1884 had been a slow, grinding execution. Go to your sister in Massachusetts, I had told her. I thought I was saving her. I thought the mills offered a steady wage and a roof. I didn't know I was sending my heart into a meat grinder. I stayed behind to work the coal barges. I broke my back for pennies, hoping to buy back our life. Every letter she sent was shorter than the last. The handwriting became shaky. The words became tired. I am well, she would write. It was a lie. I could smell the exhaustion through the paper. A child in the next row began to cry. It was a thin, hungry sound. The mother hushed the babe, pulling a threadbare shawl tighter. The sound pierced me. It reminded me of the small grave under the willow tree back home, our Sarah. She had been the first thing the poverty took. Scarlet fever doesn't care about a father's prayers. We had only 3 days of coal left when Sarah's fever began. It only cares about the lack of coal in the stove. Eleanor had held that child for 48 hours without sleeping. When the breath finally stopped, Eleanor didn't scream. She just stared at the wall. She had been staring at that same wall for years. I reached into my inner pocket. I felt the cold metal of the locket. It was the only thing I hadn't sold. I had skipped meals for months to keep it. Inside was a lock of Sarah's golden hair. It was a piece of the sun in a world of gray. I looked at Eleanor's thin neck. She had sold her own locket years ago to pay for Sarah's coffin. She didn't know I had tracked down the pawnbroker. She didn't know I had spent 3 weeks' wages to get it back. I would give it to her when we reached the west. I would give it to her when the air was clean again. The train hit a snowdrift. The entire carriage shuddered. People gasped. A man in a fine wool coat cursed under his breath. He was worried about his schedule. He was worried about his stocks and his bonds. I wanted to tell him that the world was ending outside. I wanted to tell him that his gold couldn't melt the ice. Eleanor stirred. Her eyes fluttered open for a second. They were unfocused. "Is it time for the whistle?" she whispered. Her voice was a rasp. She was still in the mill. In her mind, the bells were calling her to the looms. "No, Ellie," I said softly. "The whistles are gone." I smoothed the hair back from her forehead. "Go back to sleep." She leaned into my hand. A small, broken sound escaped her throat. It wasn't a sob. It was the sound of a spirit finally letting go of its burden. I realized then what bravery truly was. It wasn't the charging of a hill in a war. It wasn't the grand gestures of the wealthy. Bravery was Eleanor. Bravery was a woman who lost her child, her home, and her health, yet still found the strength to walk to a train station in a blizzard. She had kept her dignity in a place designed to strip it away. The Lowell girls were treated like parts of the machinery. If a finger was lost, it was replaced. Thus, if a soul was crushed, it was discarded. But they couldn't discard her. She was mine. The heater beneath us hissed. A faint smell of burning dust rose up. I thought about the justice of the world. Why did the men who owned the mills sit in velvet chairs? Why did the women who made the cloth shiver in the cold? There was no logic to it. There was only the endurance of the heart. I felt a surge of protective rage. It was a quiet, cold fire in my chest. I would build her a house. It wouldn't be large, it wouldn't be fancy, but the walls would be thick, the fire would never go out, and there would be no whistles, only the sound of the wind in the grass. We were heading toward the Dakotas. The government was giving away land to those who had the grit to hold it. They called it the Homestead Act. I called it a second chance at life. The train slowed as it moved through a deep cut in the hills. The snow was piled high above the windows. We were a needle threading through a white shroud. I looked at the other passengers. They were all running from something. The widow in black, the young man with the scarred face, the family with nothing but wooden crates. We were the debris of the Gilded Age. We were the rust scraped off the gears of progress. But rust can be cleaned, iron can be forged again. I shifted my weight, trying to ease the cramp in my leg. I didn't want to move her. Her breath was warming my neck. It was the most precious thing I owned. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the sun. I imagined the smell of wild clover. I imagined Eleanor in a yellow dress. The color of the soap we used to make, the color of Sarah's hair. I realized that love isn't a feeling. It's a choice you make every morning when your bones ache. It's the decision to stay when the world tells you to run. It's the sacrifice of your own comfort for the sake of another's rest. I am Arthur Penhaligon. I have no money in my boots. I have no title to my name, but I am the richest man on this train. I have a woman who trusts me to lead her through the dark. I have a memory of a daughter who loved the smell of wood smoke, and I have the iron will to see the sun rise. The blizzard continued to howl. The wind sounded like 1,000 wolves. But the rhythm of the wheels was stronger. Click, clack, click, clack. A heartbeat of steel, a promise of distance. Every mile was a victory. Every minute was a prayer answered. I reached down and interlaced my fingers with hers. Her hand was cold, but mine was warm. I would give her my heat. I would give her my breath. I would give her my life. Justice is a long time coming. Sometimes it doesn't come at all in this world. But dignity is something you carry inside. You don't let them take it. You don't let the lie eat it away. You keep it polished like a silver coin. Eleanor had kept hers, and I would spend the rest of my days making sure she never had to fight for it again. The train whistled, a long, mournful cry into the white night. It wasn't a factory whistle, it was a signal of passage. We were still moving. We were still alive. The oil lamp flickered, but the flame held. Shadows swallowed the far corners of the carriage. But I wasn't afraid. I could feel her heart beating against my arm. That was all the light I needed. We are the quiet ones. We are the ones who build the world and get forgotten by history. But we are the ones who know the true value of a warm hand. Stay with me. The storm will pass. The sun will find us. And when it does, we will be ready to plant our seeds. For now, there is only the snow, there is only the train, and there is the lavender scent of a home that no longer exists. But we will build a new one. I promise you, we will build a new one. The memory of her kitchen was a ghost of steam and salt. It rose from the sweat of the hearth. It lived in the sacrifice of the herd. Eleanor was rendering beef tallow back then. White fat bubbled slowly in the heavy iron pot. The smell was thick. It was rich. It was honest. She stirred the mixture with a long wooden paddle. I had carved that paddle from a fallen cherry limb. Steam rose in thick, white clouds. It dampened the stray hairs escaping her blue kerchief. She looked like a priestess presiding over a sacred altar. "Now the lie," she whispered. Her voice was a soft prayer against the winter wind. She poured the ash water into the fat. Her hand was steady. It was practiced. One mistake would sear the skin to the bone. One mistake would ruin the entire winter batch. But Eleanor never made mistakes at the hearth. She understood the alchemy of the frontier. She knew how to take the waste of a hard winter. She knew how to turn it into the cleanliness of a new spring. The fire popped. It hissed inside the belly of the stove. It was a cheerful, domestic music. That world felt 1,000 years away from this train. Here, there was only screaming metal. There were only grinding gears and the smell of soot. When the mixture thickened like heavy cream, she reached for a bottle. It was a small, amber vial. It was her only luxury in a life of grit. Lemongrass oil. She dropped it into the pot. The air changed instantly. The heavy scent of animal fat vanished. In its place came the smell of a summer meadow. It was bright. It was sharp. It was clean. She poured the liquid into wooden molds. I had lined them with damp linen earlier that morning. She moved with a grace that made hard labor look like a dance. I watched her hands. They were pink. They were soft. They were the hands of a woman who created beauty from grease. The train lurched violently. The screech of metal shook me from the memory. The brake sounded like a rusted saw hitting a knot in a pine board. I looked down at the hand resting on my knee. The Lowell mills had stolen that softness. The machines did not care about lemongrass. They did not care about the alchemy of the soul. They only cared about the production hours. The Spindle City had scrubbed the sunshine from her skin. It replaced her glow with the gray pallor of the factory floor. I touched the tip of her index finger. The skin was rough. It caught on the coarse fabric of my trousers. It was the texture of a life lived in the shadows of iron. Eleanor stirred in her sleep. A small, tired sound escaped her throat. Her grip on my hand tightened for a heartbeat. Then, she relaxed back into the abyss of exhaustion. She was still there. I could feel her beneath the layers of fatigue. The scent of her lavender shawl fought the coal smoke. It was a fragile reminder. We were still the same people who stood by that hearth. We were just older now. We were thinner. We were carrying more ghosts than we had bags. I thought about the house we would build in the West. I thought about the garden I would dig for her. There would be beef tallow. There would be wood ash. There would be wooden molds and linen liners. I would buy a gallon of lemongrass oil if it took my last cent. I would find a way to bring the softness back to her knuckles. The train gathered speed again. We plunged deeper into the white heart of Vermont. The windows were completely frosted over. The world was a blur of lace and frozen breath. I leaned my head back against the hard wooden seat. The rhythmic click-clack of the wheels was a clock. It was ticking toward a new life. We had lost 5 years to the city of spindles. We had lost the smoothness of our youth to the looms. But the fire was not out. I closed my eyes. I let the ghost of the lemongrass fill my mind. It was the only way to ignore the biting cold. It was the only way to believe in the coming spring. I sat perfectly still. I was a man guarding a treasure he had almost lost. The blizzard screamed outside the carriage. But inside, I was back in that kitchen. I was watching her stir the pot. I was waiting for the soap to set. I was waiting for us to be clean again. The weight in my waistcoat pocket was gone. It was a phantom limb. That weight had kept time for 3 generations. My father had carried that silver Waltham watch. He carried it through the blood of the Civil War. He carried it through the dust of the Kansas plains. Now, it sat in a velvet-lined tray on 42nd Street. I could still see the pawnbroker's eyes. They were yellowed like old parchment. He peered through a glass loop at my history. He did not care about the lineage of the silver. He did not care about the engraving on the back. To my son, with hope, those words were all I had left of a dead man. The broker saw only an ounce of metal. He saw a handful of brass gears. He offered me $20. I took 15 just to get out of there. I was afraid I would change my mind. The silver was still warm from my palm when I handed it over. Those $15 bought the red velvet we sat on. They bought the lace curtains at the window. They bought the privacy of this first-class carriage. Eleanor shifted her weight. Her head remained heavy on my shoulder. I had told her a lie to explain the money. I told her I found a discarded purse near the docks. I told her the universe had finally decided to be kind. She had looked at me with wide, hollow eyes. Maybe the tide is finally turning. Arthur, she whispered. She believed me because she had to. She needed to believe in a miracle to keep breathing. I reached down to adjust the wool blanket. That was when I saw the edge of her coat. The coat had been patched so many times that the stitches seemed stronger than the cloth itself. The hem was a disaster of frayed threads. There were desperate, uneven stitches everywhere. She had spent 3 winters in that coat. She walked to the mills before the sun even rose. She needed a new, thick coat. She needed it more than she needed a first-class ticket. My heart tightened. It was a dry knot in my chest. I tucked the blanket tighter around her. Then, I noticed a small parcel. It was hidden in the side pocket of her travel bag. It was wrapped in brown butcher paper. It was tied with a piece of rough, hairy twine. I knew I should not look. But a man who has lost his history is a hungry thing. I slid the parcel out slowly. I moved with the precision of a thief. I did not want to disturb the rhythm of her breath. The paper was worn. It had been handled many times by oil-stained fingers. I pulled back a corner of the wrapping. Inside was a journal. It was bound in dark, supple leather. It smelled of cedar and the promise of a library. The edges of the heavy pages were tipped in gold leaf. I opened the first page. Eleanor's handwriting trembled across the paper. For Arthur, the inscription began. So the world does not forget the stories he has to tell. The pages that followed were not blank. She had recorded every extra hour the foreman demanded. She had listed the pennies docked for broken bobbins. She had written down the names of women the mill preferred to forget. If I do not write it down, she had once told me, they will erase us twice. The journal was both a gift and a witness. She had saved a place for my story beside her own. The economic downturn of the 1880s had broken working families across the country. Banks had shuttered their doors across the nation. Men were jumping from bridges in New York. The mills had responded by cutting wages in half. They treated us like coal to be burned in a furnace. But Eleanor had been watching. She had been recording the crimes of the elite. I looked at her sleeping face. She wasn't just a victim of the industrial machine, she was its silent witness. True dignity is not found in a silver watch. It is found in the courage to remember the truth. Justice is a slow-burning fire. It requires the dry wood of sacrifice. I felt a surge of love that was almost painful. She had kept this book hidden for years. She had carried the weight of our shared suffering in ink. I realized my lie about the purse was small. Her silence was a much larger act of grace. She was protecting me from the darkness she carried. I was protecting her with a stolen luxury. We were 2 liars trying to build a truth. The train whistle shrieked again. It was a defiant cry against the storm. We were leaving the mill towns behind. The land of tall grass still waited far ahead. I tucked the journal back into her bag. I smoothed the brown paper with my thumb. The gold leaf on the edges sparkled in the dim light. It was a reminder that even in the dirt, there is gold. Even in the factory, there is a soul. We would reach the frontier soon. We would plant our seeds in the black earth. The calluses on her hands would change. They would no longer be from the friction of the loom. They would be from the handle of the plow. They would be from the soil that gives back what you put in. I leaned down and kissed her temple. The skin was cold, but her spirit was a furnace. We're almost there, I whispered into the dark. The wheels hummed a promise in response. The silver watch was gone, the soft hands were gone, but the dignity of our struggle remained. It was the only thing the mills couldn't grind down. It was the only thing the fire couldn't burn. I settled into the velvet seat. I watched the frost grow on the glass. I waited for the first light of a western sun. The journey was long, the price was high, but for Eleanor, I would pay it 1,000 times over. The train roared into the night. We were moving toward the dawn. We were moving toward justice. We were finally going home. Love, I realized, was not a grand declaration. It was a series of silent, desperate thefts. We stole from our own survival to clothe the other against the wind. We stripped ourselves bare so the other might stay warm for 1 more hour. I pulled the heavy wool blanket higher. I tucked it under her chin, sealing out the draft. Only the tip of her nose and her closed eyelids remained visible. Suddenly, the locomotive lurched. The metal groaned, a sound of agony echoing through the floorboards. The wheels screamed against the tracks as they met an immovable wall of white. The air in our small corner grew dense. It was the weight of secrets held in the dark. It was the gravity of two hearts beating against the inevitable. I leaned my forehead against the vibrating glass. The frost was crawling across the pane like a crystal vine. I didn't need a ticking clock to know our time was finite. I didn't need a silver face to tell me the sun was a stranger. I only needed the rhythm of her breath against my ribs. Each inhale was a defiant shout against the mills of the east. Each exhale was a quiet plea for the soil of the west. I touched the leather through the bag one last time. I made a silent vow to the woman sleeping beside me. I would fill every page of that book. I would write about the way the light caught the silver in her hair. I would record the blueprint of the house we would build. I would make her sacrifice a monument of ink and truth. A single tear escaped, hot and stinging. It hit the back of my hand like a drop of molten lead. I wiped it away with a quick, angry motion. I could not afford the luxury of weakness. We were plunging into a white void. We were leaving the smoke, the gears, and the tyranny of the whistle behind. We were two ghosts seeking a body, and in the heart of this Vermont storm, her presence was my only North Star. The engine gave one final, shuddering gasp of steam. Then, the world fell into a terrifying silence. It was a quiet so loud it made my ears ring. The heartbeat of the rails had flatlined. Outside, the landscape had vanished into a swirling, milk-white abyss. Nature had finally caught the iron horse. The great blizzard of 1888 was no longer a storm. It was a predator. I felt the cold beginning its slow, methodical invasion. It crept through the floorboards like a ghost. It sought out the gaps in our coats and the cracks in our resolve. Eleanor stirred, her lashes fluttering against her cheeks. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, they reflected the frost on the glass. She didn't look for the conductor. She didn't look for the exit. She looked only at me. "The world has stopped, hasn't it, Arthur?" she whispered. Her voice was a thread of silk, pulled to the breaking point. "The snow is too deep," I said. I forced my voice to be as steady as a mountain. "The conductor says we're just waiting for the plows from the north." It was a lie, and we both felt it in the freezing air. The wind slammed against the carriage wall. It was a mournful, hungry howl. It sounded like the spirits of the mountains reclaiming their territory. In the center of the car, a single kerosene lamp fought to stay alive. The light was a weak, jaundiced amber. It cast long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The other passengers were merely shapes in the gloom. A man in the back coughed, a dry, rattling sound. A mother hummed a lullaby, her voice cracking with the cold. But here, in our velvet sanctuary, we were the only survivors of a lost world. I reached into my pack and found the last of our bread. It was a hard, dry heel of rye. I snapped it in two. The sound was like a gunshot in the muffled cabin. I offered the larger piece to her. "Eat," I commanded softly. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on my empty hands. "We should wait, Arthur," she murmured. "We don't know how long we'll be here." "There is no waiting," I replied. "We need the heat in our blood now." She took the bread with fingers that had lost their color. We ate in a heavy, sacred silence. The dry crumbs were difficult to swallow. Yet, this was the most profound meal of my life. It was a communion of the dispossessed. We were breaking more than just grain. We were shattering the despair that tried to settle in our marrow. I stood up and pulled my heavy wool coat from my shoulders. I draped it over her, layering it atop her own thin wrap. "Arthur, no," she protested, reaching for my arm. "You'll catch your death." "I have the fire of 1,000 dreams to keep me warm," I said. I forced a grin, though my chest felt tight with the sudden chill. "Besides, I'm too stubborn to freeze." She smiled, and the shadows seemed to retreat. It was a small, fragile light, more powerful than the kerosene lamp. "Tell me one," she said, leaning her head back. She pulled the layers of wool tight against her chest. "Tell me about the place with the trees." I closed my eyes, letting the darkness of the train transform. I didn't see the snow burying the windows. I didn't hear the wind screaming for entry. I saw a rolling hillside bathed in the gold of a late September sun. It sits in a valley, I began. The mountains wrap around it like a mother's arms. I felt her cold hand slide into mine beneath the blankets. Her grip was surprisingly firm. There is a creek at the bottom of the slope, I continued. The water is so clear you can see the speckled trout hiding in the shadows. I described the smell of the pine needles. I talked about the porch where we would sit when the work was done. I spoke of justice, not as a word, but as a piece of land. A place where a man's labor belonged to him alone. A place where a woman's hands were for holding, not for bleeding. We will plant apple trees, she whispered, her eyes still closed. And roses, I added, by the front door. The temperature continued to drop. I could see my own breath now, a white cloud in the dimness. But the vision of the valley was a shield. True courage wasn't the absence of the cold. It was the refusal to let the cold reach the heart. The blizzard of '88 had trapped the machine, but it couldn't trap the soul. We sat there, huddled together as the train became a frozen monument. We were a testament to the fact that human dignity cannot be ground down. The mills had failed to break us. The fire had failed to consume us. And now the ice would find that we were far too warm to claim. I held her hand and watched the white dark. We were home because we were together. Everything else was just a map yet to be drawn. The wind roared, but I only heard her steady, quiet breathing. We were waiting for the dawn. We were waiting for the world to turn. We were Arthur and Eleanor, and we were infinite. You'll hear it from the porch at night. The wind roared outside, a relentless beast clawing at the wooden frame of the train car. I described the house I wanted to build for her, painting it against the canvas of the swirling white dark. It would not be a grand mansion like the stone fortresses of the Vanderbilt family on Fifth Avenue. Those houses were built of ego and cold marble. Ours would be a sturdy house, rooted in the open earth of Dakota Territory. I saw it in my mind. Every notch in the cedar logs and every stone in the chimney. The hearth would take up an entire wall, a monument to warmth in a world that had forgotten the sun. I'll build the fireplace deep, I said, my voice barely a whisper against the gale. So deep you could roast a whole hog if you wanted to, though we'll stick to stew and bread. But we'll mostly use it for pine knots. They smell like the heart of the forest when they burn, sharp and sweet. Eleanor squeezed my hand, her fingers trembling but her grip firm. And the orchard. Arthur, don't forget the orchard. I leaned closer to her, my forehead almost touching hers in the freezing dimness. I could smell the faint, lingering scent of lavender from her hair, a ghost of the summer we spent in the meadows. It defied the suffocating smell of kerosene and the stale air of the carriage. 10 rows of apples, I promised, visualizing the saplings I would plant, Baldwins for the pies, Greenings for the sauce, and Northern Spies for the long winter nights. In the spring, the whole hill will be white with blossoms, a sea of petals. It will look like it's snowing, Eleanor, but the air will be warm and soft. I spoke the words like I was weaving a protective spell around us. I wanted to build that world for her, brick by brick, leaf by leaf, in the middle of this frozen purgatory. I wanted to push back the great white hurricane of 1888 with the sheer force of my imagination. We'll have a garden for you, I said, feeling the heat of her skin against my palm. Right near the kitchen door, where the morning sun hits first, rosemary, thyme, and the biggest pumpkins the county has ever seen. And sunflowers, she added softly, her voice a fragile thread of hope. Along the fence line, Arthur. So they can watch the sun all day, even when we are inside. Sunflowers, I agreed, closing my eyes to see the yellow giants nodding in the breeze. We sat there for a long time, two souls dreaming in the heart of a frozen machine. The cold was still there, a sharp, invisible blade biting at our toes and ears. The train groaned, the metal plates shrieking as the snow piled higher against the windows. It was burying us, turning the carriage into a tomb of iron and ice. But the fear had retreated, driven back by the scent of imaginary apples. It couldn't live in the same space as the sunflowers and the promise of a stone hearth. Arthur, she whispered after a while, her breath a tiny cloud in the dark. Do you really think we can get there? We're already halfway, I said, my heart pounding with a sudden, fierce conviction. This storm is just the world's way of asking us how badly we want our life. It is testing whether we are worthy of the spring. I pulled her closer, tucking her head under my chin to shield her from the drafts. I felt the heat of her breath against my neck, the most precious warmth in the universe. The blizzard was a monster of ice and wind, a historical catastrophe in the making. It was stopping the pulse of the nation, burying the telegraph lines and the tracks. It was a force of nature that would be talked about for 100 years. But in that moment, it was nothing more than a backdrop to our survival. It was a stage set for the quiet, steady beating of two hearts that refused to stop. I felt a strange sense of peace, a clarity I had never known in the city. In the textile mills of Lowell, time was measured by the piercing whistle and the iron clock. Life was a series of scheduled movements, a cog in a machine that didn't care for blood. In New York, time was measured by the frantic hustle of the crowd and the clatter of hooves. Here, trapped in the drifts, time had finally lost its teeth. There was only the eternal now, the weight of her body against mine. There was only the gravity of the promise I had made to the girl from the valley. I realized then that I didn't need the silver watch I had sold to buy our passage. I didn't need a ticking hand of brass to tell me when to love her or when to fight. I didn't need a dial to tell me that our life was beginning in the middle of a storm. The wind rattled the glass, a desperate intruder trying to break the seal. A piece of ice scraped against the metal, sounding like a skeletal fingernail on a chalkboard. Eleanor shivered, her frame shaking as the cold settled deeper. But she didn't pull away. She burrowed deeper into the nest of coats we had made. I can see them, she said, her voice muffled by the wool of my shirt. The apples, I asked, smiling despite the numbness in my face. No, she said, and I could hear the smile in her own voice. The sunflowers. They're so bright, they hurt my eyes. Arthur? I smiled into the darkness, knowing exactly what she meant. We weren't just two Irish immigrants trapped on a stalled train in the middle of a white void. We were explorers of a new frontier, pioneers of a country that existed in our shared gaze. I felt a surge of strength that had nothing to do with food or rest or youth. It was the primal strength of a man who has finally found his holy purpose. I would be her wall against the wind. I would be her fire against the frost. I would be the rich, dark soil that held her roots and kept her standing. Sleep now, Eleanor, I whispered, kissing the top of her head. I'll keep watch for the spring, I promise. She didn't argue this time, the exhaustion of the journey finally claiming her. Her breathing slowed, becoming a rhythmic counterpoint to the howling gale outside. I stayed awake, watching the kerosene lamp flicker lower and lower on its hook. I watched the frost grow in intricate, jagged patterns until it covered the glass completely. I was a man in a tomb of ice, breathing the air of a dying flame. But I had never felt more alive, more tethered to the reality of existence. The world outside was white and dead, a lunar landscape of frozen tragedy. But inside my chest, the orchard was already in bloom, the air thick with summer. I could almost hear the bees. I could almost taste the honey on my tongue. I leaned my head back and stared at the dark ceiling of the carriage. The storm could roar until the sky fell. It could pile the snow to the stars. It didn't matter because we had already crossed the greatest distance. We were going west, toward a life we had carved out of hope and sweat. Even if we never moved another inch of track, we were already home. The kerosene lamp on the hook flickered violently, a dying star in the cabin. It was reaching the end, the oil low and the flame dancing like a ghost. Eleanor was still leaning against me, her breath a steady, trusting rhythm. I reached down beneath the heavy wool coat I had draped over her small frame. I wanted to find her hand, to hold the physical proof of our union. I wanted to make sure the cold hadn't crept into her bones while she dreamed. I found her right hand tucked into the fold of her heavy calico skirt. I took it in mine, expecting the soft, familiar skin of the woman I loved. But my thumb grazed something hard and unexpected, something jagged and rough that didn't belong on a supervisor's hand. I pulled her hand closer to the fading, amber light of the lamp. I didn't want to wake her, but a cold knot of dread was tightening in my stomach. The skin of her palm was not the smooth surface she had described in her letters. It was mapped with rows of tiny, white ridges, scars of 1,000 repetitions. Her fingertips were thickened with calluses that felt like dried, cured leather. Across the pad of her index finger, there were dozens of tiny, dark pricks. They looked like a miniature constellation of stars, captured forever under the skin. I ran my finger over a thin, silver scar that ran from her thumb to her wrist. It was the mark of a jagged blade, or perhaps the snap of a high-tension needle. Eleanor stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she felt my touch on her palm. She didn't pull away at first, the fog of sleep still clouding her mind. Then she saw me looking at her hand in the dying light of the lamp. She tried to curl her fingers into a fist, a reflexive move to hide the truth. She tried to hide the physical evidence of the years of brutal labor. "Don't, Eleanor," I whispered, my voice breaking with a sudden, sharp pain. I held her wrist gently, but firmly, refusing to let her vanish back into her lies. "What is this?" I asked, my heart sinking as I realized the depth of her sacrifice. The wind outside gave a mournful howl, shaking the carriage like a toy. She looked at the frost on the window, unable to meet the judgment in my eyes. "It's nothing, Arthur," she said, her voice small and tight. "It's just work. It's what everyone does to get by." "You told me the mill was easy," I said, the guilt rising in my throat like bile. "You told me you were just a supervisor, watching the girls at the looms. You lied to me every single week for 3 years." I felt a pang of shame that was sharper than any winter wind. I had been so proud of my sacrifice, selling my father's watch to pay for the tickets. I had thought myself the hero of our story, the one who bore the burden, but she had been bleeding in silence, her fingers pricked by 1,000 needles. She had worked the grave shift in the garment district, the places where light never reached. While I was dreaming of orchards, she was losing the softness of her youth to a machine. "I did it for the house," she whispered, a tear finally tracking through the soot on her cheek. "I did it so we wouldn't have to wait another 5 years. The sunflowers, Arthur, they don't grow in the dark of the factories." I pulled her hand to my lips and kissed the calloused skin, the scars tasting of salt. This was the true face of courage, not the bravado of a man with a dream. It was the quiet, agonizing endurance of a woman who gives her body for love. She had traded her beauty for our future, one stitch at a time. Justice was a word for the wealthy. For us, there was only the dignity of the struggle. "We'll get there," I promised, my voice thick with a new kind of resolve. "And those hands will never touch a needle again." The lamp gave a weak flare, then settled into a thin blue flame, but I could still see the sunflowers glowing in the dark of my soul. We were 2 broken pieces making a whole, stronger than the storm. The great blizzard of '88 could freeze the world, but it could not freeze us. We held each other in the blackness. 2 hearts beating against the end of the world. I knew then that the house wouldn't be built of cedar and stone alone. It would be built on the scars of her hands and the weight of my promises. We were Arthur and Eleanor, and we were finally, truly home. I had walked around with my head in the clouds. I thought I was the only one carrying the weight of our future. I thought my sweat was the only currency we had. She let out a long, shaky breath. The steam from her mouth curled around us like a ghost. "I couldn't let you lose the land, Arthur." Her voice was a thin wire of steel. "I saw the letters from the bank in Pennsylvania. I saw the black ink on those notices before we even left for New York." My heart stopped. I thought I had hidden those papers in the very bottom of my trunk. I thought I had buried our failure under my old work shirts. "Your father's debts were going to swallow us before we even started," she whispered. I stared at her, stunned. The world outside was a white void, but inside, a new map was unfolding. "I took in extra work," she said. Her voice was barely a murmur. It competed with the rattling of the stalled train. After the bells rang at the mill, I stayed behind. The foreman let me use a corner of the cutting room. I sewed for the garment district. Coats, trousers, waistcoats, anything that needed a fine stitch and a fast hand. She looked down at her palm. "The needle doesn't care if you're tired, Arthur. It bites when you stop paying attention. I worked by the light of a single tallow candle until my eyes burned. I looked at the scars again. I didn't see injuries anymore. I saw a ledger. Every mark was a debt paid. Every callus was a day closer to our freedom. I saved every penny, she continued, but I put it in the tin box under the floorboards. It wasn't just the mill wages. It was the night work that paid off the interest on your father's farm. I felt small. I felt like a boy playing at being a man. I thought about her in that cold, dark factory. The other girls had gone home to their mothers and their beds. She stayed. I thought about her shoulders aching. I thought about her fingers bleeding in the dim light of 1887. She had fought a war in the shadows while I dreamed of soil. And the quilt, I asked. I remembered a heavy, colorful bundle. She had insisted on carrying it herself across every platform. She hadn't let me put it in the main luggage. A small smile touched her lips. Her eyes remained sad, reflecting the flickering lamp. That was my masterpiece. I couldn't bear to see the scraps go to waste. Every time a rich man's suit was cut, there were pieces left over. Fine wool, silk linings, heavy tweed. The foreman said I could keep the remnants. She closed her eyes, remembering the feel of the fabric. I spent 6 months piecing it together. I didn't have a pattern. I just followed the colors. I put a piece of my old blue Sunday dress in the center, the one I wore when you first asked me to dance. I surrounded it with the gray of the New York sky. I added bits of red flannel from a child's winter coat. I stitched them all with a double-blind seam. I wanted it to be strong enough to last 100 winters. I wanted it to be the first thing we put on our bed in the West. She opened her eyes and looked at me. I called it the map of scraps, because that's what our life was, wasn't it? Just scraps of hope we found in the dirt. Sewn together with prayer and a steady hand, I lifted her hand to my lips. I didn't care about the grease or the grit. I kissed the calluses. I kissed the tiny needle pricks. I kissed the silver scar on her wrist. The texture of her skin told a story of devotion. No book could ever capture this. It was a rugged, frontier kind of love. It wasn't about flowers or poetry. It wasn't about the grand gestures of the wealthy. It was about endurance. It was about a woman who refused to let her man fail. You should have told me, Ta, I said. My voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I would have worked harder. I would have found a way. She shook her head. Her hair caught the last glimmer of the dying light. You were already working until your bones rattled, Arthur. A house can't stand on one pillar. It needs two. I am the other pillar. We sat there for a long time. We held hands as the temperature in the carriage dropped. I didn't care about my missing watch anymore. Time didn't matter when you were touching eternity. I didn't care about the cold. I realized that the greatest treasure I possessed wasn't made of silver. It wasn't something a thief could take. It was the iron will of the woman sitting next to me. She had built our future with a needle and thread. She had bled for the dirt we hadn't even bought yet. I thought about the women in my life. I thought about the things they made with their hands. My mother's knitted socks that kept us from frostbite. My grandmother's carved wooden spoons. There is a soul in something made by hand. A factory machine in a city can never replicate it. It carries the heartbeat of the maker. It carries their patience. It carries their sacrifice. Every stitch Eleanor made was a silent, I love you. Every knot she tied was a promise that she wouldn't let go of me. I wonder if you have something like that in your home. A quilt passed down through generations of mothers. A hand-carved box that holds your deepest secrets. A sweater with a mistake in the weave. A mistake that only you and the maker know about. If you have a memory of a handmade gift, hold it close. Think of the hours of a human life poured into that object. Tell me about the feeling of holding someone's hard work. I believe those objects are the real anchors of our history. They are more important than the dates in a school book. I looked back at Eleanor. She was leaning her head on my shoulder again. The lamp sputtered, shrinking to a thin blue flame. The carriage sank into a dim blue gloom. The only light came from the blue-white glare of the snow. Oh, the blizzard of '88 roared outside like a wounded beast. But I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I could feel the heat radiating from her. I could feel the strength in her scarred hand. It was still gripped firmly in mine. We were a map of scraps, indeed, but we were being sewn into something beautiful. The blizzard could keep screaming. The train could stay buried until April for all I cared. As long as I held that hand, I knew the way out. I closed my eyes and pictured the quilt. I saw the red flannel and the blue silk in my mind. I saw the thousands of stitches. Each one was a tiny victory over despair. I promised myself something then. One day, those hands would only pick apples in our orchard. Those hands would only hold sunflowers from our garden. I would spend the rest of my life ensuring her comfort. She would never have to sew in the dark again. But for now, in the freezing heart of 1888, her scars were my only light. They were the stars I steered my soul by. I had never seen anything more beautiful in my entire life. The man came to a halt beside our tattered bench. He adjusted a silk top hat. The accessory looked ridiculous amidst the swirling Vermont snow. He retrieved a heavy gold hunter case watch from his waistcoat. With a practiced, arrogant flick of his thumb, he snapped the lid open. The polished gold caught the dim, ghostly blue light bleeding through the frosted windows. "Inexcusable," the man barked. He did not look at us. He addressed the frozen air as if it were a disobedient servant. 3 hours behind the scheduled arrival. Not a single porter to be found in this godforsaken wilderness. The railroad board shall hear of this gross negligence. He finally turned his gaze toward our corner. His upper lip curled with a disdain that had nothing to do with the biting draft. His eyes traveled slowly over Eleanor's faded wool shawl. He lingered on the frayed hem of my own coat. I had patched that sleeve with a scrap of rough canvas back in Harrisburg. He saw the coal soot etched into the lines of our faces. He saw how we huddled together, two bodies trying to steal warmth from a shared breath. "It appears they are permitting livestock into the passenger coaches now," he said. His voice dripped with a casual, polished cruelty. "One pays for a first-class ticket specifically to avoid the stench of the factories." I felt a sudden, sharp heat rise in my throat. It was a fire the iron stove in the corner could never produce. My fingers curled into a white-knuckled fist beneath the seat. I thought of my father's silver pocket watch. It was currently resting in a dusty pawnshop window on the Lower East Side. We had traded that family legacy just to afford these two hard wooden spots in this very car. I thought of the hard years that had already emptied farms and darkened factory towns. I thought of the working families who stood in long lines for bread. I thought of Eleanor's hands. They were hidden now, but I knew every scar on them. Those marks were earned from years of sewing silk waistcoats for men exactly like him. She had spent her youth in dim rooms, breathing in fabric dust for pennies a day. I began to stand up. My heavy work boots creaked against the floorboards. I wanted to wipe that smirk off his pampered, powdered face. I wanted to use the rough, calloused edge of a Pennsylvania farmer's hand to teach him a lesson. I wanted to show him exactly what the livestock thought of his gold watch and his Hudson Line title, but a hand caught my wrist. It was a small hand, yet it possessed the sudden, unyielding strength of iron wire. Eleanor did not look at me. She kept her eyes fixed directly on the man in the beaverskin coat. She did not flinch. She did not lower her chin in a show of subservience. She rose from the seat slowly. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, and carried an unexpected weight. She looked as though she were stepping out of a high society portrait. The dust on her skirts and the exhaustion in her eyes only added to her stature. "The snow does not check the price of a ticket before it falls, sir," she said. Her voice was low and steady. It carried the quiet, irresistible authority of a mountain stream. The man blinked. He looked genuinely startled that the scenery had found its voice. "It is a tragedy, I suppose," she continued. Her eyes remained locked on his, refusing to grant him the comfort of her silence. "That you have spent a fortune on a timepiece, yet you have no concept of what time it actually is." The man's face flushed a deep, bruised shade of crimson. "Watch your tongue, woman," he hissed. "I am a director of the Hudson Line." Eleanor offered him a faint, pitying smile. It was the kind of smile one gives a lost child who is bragging about a shiny pebble. "Then you should know that these iron rails are only as strong as the men who laid them in the frozen mud," she said. "And the fine wool you wear was stitched by women who haven't felt the warmth of the sun in 3 years." She reached out, With a feather-light touch, she brushed the sleeve of his expensive coat. "This wool is exquisite, sir. But it will not keep your heart from turning to ice if you have forgotten how to be a neighbor. We are all trapped in the same drift tonight. The blizzard does not care about your titles or your director's meetings. It only cares if you have enough soul left to keep from freezing from the inside out." The man opened his mouth to deliver a scathing retort, but the words seemed to wither and die in his throat. There was a devastating dignity in her posture that all his gold could never purchase. She wasn't begging for his respect, she was offering him a final, desperate chance to earn hers. He looked down at his gold watch again. The flourish was gone. The arrogance had leaked out of him like air from a punctured lung. He snapped the lid shut with a dull, hollow thud. He turned on his heel without uttering another word. He retreated toward the forward car, his boots clicking rhythmically away. The heavy door slammed shut behind him. The sound cut off the draft of his cold presence. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I sank back into the hard seat. My heart was still thumping with the lingering ghost of a fight. "You should have let me handle him, I whispered into the silence. She sat back down and carefully smoothed the wrinkles in her skirt. She looked at her hands. I saw the needle scars and the thick calluses of a life lived in the shadows of industry. "He isn't worth the bruises on your knuckles." "Arthur," she said softly, "men like him believe the world is nothing but a ladder. They spend their entire lives looking down. They are terrified that if they stop climbing, they might actually have to see the people they've stepped on." She leaned her head back against the velvet headrest. "I would rather be in the dirt with you than on a gold rung with a man like that." I looked at her in the dim, flickering light of the kerosene lamp. I realized then that she hadn't just protected my pride, she had protected my humanity. She had kept me from becoming the very thing I despised. She refused to let me solve a problem with the same anger the world had used against us. She was the steady hand on the rudder of my soul. I reached over and took her hand. I laced my fingers through hers, feeling the strength in her grip. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" I asked. She smiled. It was a real smile this time, though the shadows under her eyes told of a deep weariness. "My mother used to say that a sharp tongue is like a pair of pruning shears." "Oh," she murmured. "You only use it when the weeds start to choke the beauty out of the garden." We sat in the heavy silence for a long time after that. The blizzard continued to scream against the iron hull of the train, but inside our small circle, something fundamental had shifted. The air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from the cabin. The shadows cast by the storm seemed less like monsters and more like blankets. I thought about the people we had left behind in Pennsylvania. I thought of the men who worked the soil until their backs broke. I thought of the women who prayed for rain and shared their last crust of bread when the winter grew lean. They didn't possess beaver coats or silk hats. They didn't have gold watches to tell them when they were late for a meeting. But they possessed a wealth the director of the Hudson Line would never comprehend. They had the wealth of belonging to one another. They had the dignity of a life built on sacrifice rather than theft. I looked at Eleanor's profile against the frosted window pane. The ice crystals on the glass looked like tiny, jagged stars. She was the richest person I had ever known. She carried her fortune in the resilience of her spirit. She carried her legacy in the straightness of her back. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of gratitude for the snow. If we hadn't been stranded in this white void, I might never have seen her stand like that. I might never have fully understood the power of the woman I was taking to the edge of the world. She wasn't just following me toward a new life, she was leading me there. She was showing me that the frontier wasn't just a patch of dirt on a surveyor's map, it was a state of mind. It was the courage to stand tall when the world tried to make you feel small. It was the justice of a kind word in a cold place. "Arthur," she murmured. Her eyes were half closed now, drifting toward sleep. "Yes, Alta, when we finally get to our land. Let's not build any fences." I squeezed her hand, feeling the pulse of her heart against my palm. "No fences," I promised. "Just rows of trees and a wide porch that faces the sunset," she added. "So we can see anyone coming from a mile away, and we will always keep a pot of coffee ready on the stove." "Even for men in beaver coats," I teased her gently. She let out a soft, tired laugh that warmed the space between us. "Especially for them, Arthur." They are the ones who need to remember what a home feels like the most. I looked out into the white darkness. The wind howled, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a song of the road, a song of the struggle, and a song of the love that would see us through to the dawn. We were not just passengers on a stalled train. We were the architects of a world that hadn't been built yet. And as long as she held my hand, I knew the foundation would never crack. The cold could stay outside. Inside, we had more than enough fire to last a lifetime. I leaned my head against hers. The train groaned. Ice settled on the roof with a heavy, crystalline weight. I no longer cared about the delay. The gold watches did not matter. The first-class titles felt like hollow echoes. I had everything I needed in the palm of my hand. I held a map of scraps. I held a woman of iron. We were headed for a place where the dirt did not know your name, but that dirt would respect your sweat. It was a land where a man was measured by his character, not by the thread count of his coat. The darkness deepened. A strange sense of peace settled over me. The storm was a wall, but it was also a cocoon. It stripped away the finery. It burned away the pride. It removed the pretense of our old lives in the East. Only the truth remained. Only we remained. I listened to her breathing. It was slow. It was steady. She had fought a war of words and won. She had turned a moment of shame into a moment of grace. I drifted toward a shallow sleep. One thing became certain in my mind. The West would not break Eleanor. The West was going to recognize her. She was made of the same granite as the mountains. She was the storm. She was the shelter. I felt like the luckiest man ever to be buried in a snowdrift. The lamp on the wall sputtered. The kerosene was running low. The flame danced like a ghost against the frosted glass. Outside, the wind stopped screaming. It turned into a long, low moan. It sounded like a voice calling from a great distance. It sounded like a memory I had tried to outrun for 300 miles. Eleanor looked out at the blackness. She did not see the snow. She was seeing a small house in the woods. She was seeing a ghost from 3 years ago. She reached down. She touched the edge of the colorful quilt in her lap. Her fingers traced a square of faded blue wool. I knew that scrap of fabric. It came from Sarah's little blue coat, a coat that had never been worn out into the sun. It would have been Sarah's birthday today, Arthur. Her voice was quiet. It barely disturbed the freezing air. A sharp, cold needle pricked my heart. I had been counting the days too. I just had not dared to say it. I thought the shadows would not find us if I stayed silent. I know, Elle, I whispered. I know. She turned her head. Her cheek rested against the cold window pane. The wind sounds just like that night. The way it hissed through the cracks in the floorboards. The way the stove couldn't keep the frost away. I remembered the weight of that silence. I remembered the 3-mile trek. I had fought through waist-deep drifts. I was looking for Dr. Miller. I remembered the look on his face when he opened the door. His eyes were sunken with exhaustion. That winter had been hard on everyone. The long economic depression had clawed at the country's spirit. Men were jumping off bridges in New York. Fathers were starving in the streets of Chicago. And in our little corner of the woods, the world was simply freezing over. I can't get the horse out, Arthur, the doctor had said. I can't even get to the barn. He handed me a small bottle of tincture. He gave me a look of hollow pity. I ran all the way back. My lungs burned like they were filled with crushed glass. The air felt like a physical blow to the chest. I arrived too late. The tincture stayed in my pocket. It was never opened. It was a useless weight. I should have left earlier, I said. The old bitterness rose in my throat. I should have seen the fever coming. Eleanor shook her head. She took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly tight. No, Arthur, you fought the mountain that night. You did everything a man could do. She looked down at her lap. Her eyes glistened in the dying light. I remember how small she felt, like a bird that had fallen from the nest. I stayed awake for 3 days afterward. I was just waiting for the sound of a breath. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. We sat in that shared silence. The train car felt like a confessional. The other passengers were blurs of shadow. They were lost in their own miseries. In this corner of the world, it was just us. Us and the ghost of a little girl who never grew. I kept the lock of hair, Arthur. She reached into a hidden pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, tattered envelope. Inside was a single curl of golden down. It was soft as a dandelion seed. I had not known she kept it. She had saved a second curl, separate from the one hidden inside my locket. Seeing it there broke something inside me. The man of iron I tried to be crumbled. I put my face in my hands. I wanted to give her the world, Elle. I wanted to show her the river. I wanted to watch the hawks circle the valley with her. I wanted to build her a swing under the big oak. She shifted closer. She wrapped a corner of the quilt around my shoulders. She knew she was loved, Arthur. In the short time her heart beat, she knew only us. That is more than some people get in 80 years. She leaned her head against mine. Her tears dampened my collar. I used to blame the winter. I used to hate the snow. But tonight, sitting here, I realized something. The cold didn't take her. It just ushered her home a little sooner. I looked at the small curl of hair. It was fragile, yet it had survived the factory fires of our old town. It had survived the crowded tenements. It had survived the long journey across the plains. It was a piece of her that the world could not touch. "We are going to plant a tree for her," I said. My voice was thick. "On the highest hill of our new land." "An apple tree?" she asked. A small, trembling smile touched her lips. "Yes. So the blossoms can fall like snow in the spring, but a snow that doesn't bite." She tucked the envelope back into her pocket. She patted it gently. "I felt her today, you know, when that man was yelling about his watch. I felt a little tug at my spirit, like a reminder. Life is too short to spend it being angry at fools. That is why I stood up. I wasn't just defending you, Arthur. I was defending the kind of world I want our children to live in." The word children hung in the air. It was heavy with hope. It was heavy with fear. We had not spoken of the future like that in a long time. Loss had made us cautious. We were like people walking on thin ice, but here, in this frozen wasteland, the ice felt solid. We had survived the worst thing that can happen to a heart. The rest was just weather. I thought about the men in the front of the train. They fought for gold. They fought for status. They fought for a seat at a table that would eventually rot. But Eleanor fought for dignity. She fought for the memory of a little girl whose life had ended far too soon. She fought for the right to be human in a world that treated us like coal for the engine. "Do you think Sarah would have liked the West, Elle?" She looked toward the front of the car. The snow was beginning to pile against the glass. "She would have loved the space," she whispered. "She was always reaching for things she couldn't touch. Now she has the whole sky." I pulled her closer. The cold was still there. The hunger was a dull ache in my stomach, but my soul felt full. We were not just pioneers. We were survivors of an old world. We were refugees from a life of yes, sir, and no, sir. In the East, we were cogs. In the West, we were kings of our own dirt. The locomotive hissed. Steam billowed past the window. It looked like a white shroud, or a white flag of surrender from the storm. "We are going to make it," I promised. I wasn't talking about the train ride. I was talking about the life. I was talking about the years ahead. "I know," she said, "because we didn't leave her behind. We brought her with us." She gripped the blue scrap of the quilt. Her knuckles were white. "Justice isn't something the law gives you, Arthur. It's something you build with your own hands. By refusing to be small. By refusing to let the cold turn your heart to stone." I kissed her forehead. The skin was lined with the maps of our struggles. To me, she was more beautiful than the day I met her. Her beauty wasn't in her youth anymore. It was in her endurance. It was in the way she carried the weight of the world without breaking her back. The lamp trembled on its hook. Its flame was barely strong enough to hold back the dark. But I didn't feel blind. I could see the apple tree. I could see the blossoms. I could see the porch facing the sunset. I could see the life we had earned. One drop of sweat at a time, one prayer at a time. We sat together in the dark. The heart of the train was cold, but the heart of the man was a furnace. The West was waiting, and we were coming for it, with nothing but a quilt and a lock of hair, and a love that the winter could never kill. We were the architects of a new dawn, even if the night was 3 years long, even if the snow was 10 feet deep. We were the fire, and the fire would always burn. Rest now, Eleanor, I whispered. The morning is coming, and the land is waiting for us to wake it up. She sighed against my chest, a long, peaceful sound. The storm continued to howl, but it sounded like an invitation. It sounded like home. I closed my eyes. I saw the golden curl in the sun. I saw the apple blossoms. I saw the end of the road, and it was good. It was finally, truly good. The iron wheels would turn again. The sun would find the track, and we would walk into the light, not as victims of the East, but as masters of the West. Dignity was our compass. Love was our map, and Sarah was our star. We were going home. For the very first time, the cold didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the breath in our lungs, and the grip of a hand that would never let go. The West was not just a place, it was a promise kept. A promise of a tree on a hill. A promise of a snow that didn't bite. A promise of a life well lived, in the name of the one we lost, and the ones yet to come. I held her tight. The darkness was beautiful. The silence was a prayer, and the prayer was answered. We were alive, and that was enough. That was everything. She looked out at the dark horizon. The stars were finally beginning to peek through the thinning clouds. They looked like pinpricks of hope in a shroud of charcoal silk. I think she's already there, Arthur, waiting for us to catch up. She's in the wind that doesn't howl anymore. She's in the wide open spaces we haven't even seen yet. I pulled her closer to my chest. My arm acted as a shield against the biting draft snaking through the window frame. I thought about the doctor's useless bottle of brown medicine tucked in my coat. It was a bitter tonic of opium and herbs. It was a lie sold for $2 in a dusty Missouri pharmacy. I realized then that the only real medicine was this. The speaking of names that had been forbidden by our own grief. The sharing of the weight that had been crushing my ribs for a year. The refusal to let the darkness have the final, hollow word. The wind outside gave one final, long sigh. It sounded like a ghost departing. Then, the world went still. Total, terrifying silence. The valley was held in a white, crystalline peace. I watched Eleanor's eyes grow heavy in the faint blue light reflected from the snow. The burden of the memory had been aired out. It was like a heavy, soot-stained rug, finally beaten clean on a spring morning. Sleep, Elle, I murmured into her hair. I'll watch the lamp. Don't let it go out, she whispered. Her voice drifted off into the shadows of the railcar. I won't. I promise. I sat there for a long time. I watched the tiny flame struggle against the cold. It was a miniature sun in a universe of ice. I thought about all the mothers in all the small sod cabins across this frontier. The great blizzard of 1888 had turned the West into a graveyard of white. I thought of the school children's blizzard just months ago in January. Families across the frontier were still mourning loved ones lost to that terrible winter, the ones who had buried pieces of their hearts in the rocky, unyielding soil, the ones who kept moving westward anyway. They were the true architects of this nation, not the arrogant generals or the greedy railroad barons, but the women who carried a grief as heavy as the Sierra Nevada, women who still found a way to smile at the rising sun. I looked at my hands, the hands of a farmer, the hands of a builder. They were shaking slightly in the dimness. I took a deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs like shards of glass. I wasn't just a man taking a woman to a new territory. I was a man carrying a legacy of love and a mountain of loss. And for the first time, the loss didn't feel like a bottomless hole. It felt like a foundation. It was the stone upon which we would build our new porch. The lamp finally flickered. It sputtered once and died. The car plunged into a deep, bruised blue shadow. But I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I had the warmth of her breath against my neck. I had the memory of a golden curl tucked inside a tattered envelope in my pocket. and I had the promise of a hill in Dakota Territory, a hill where the apple blossoms would never freeze in the bud. We were still stuck in a snowdrift in the middle of nowhere. The iron tracks were still buried under 6 feet of white death. But in the quiet of that 1888 night, we were finally moving again. We were heading home. The first light of morning didn't break over the horizon. It bled through the frosted glass. It came in shades of bruised purple and cold gray. The wind had finally lost its teeth. Outside, a new sound began to echo, the muffled, rhythmic thud of iron shovels against packed snow. Men were shouting somewhere near the stalled steam engine. The sound of progress felt abrasive and loud. It violated the holy silence of the night we had just shared. My left shoulder had gone completely numb hours ago. I didn't mind the loss of feeling. It was a small price to pay. It was an honor to bear the weight of Eleanor's head. She was still tucked under the corner of the hand-stitched quilt. Her breathing was rhythmic, soft. I watched a single crystal of frost melt on the window pane. The heat from our bodies was finally winning. The crystal turned into a bead of water. It tracked slowly down the glass like a solitary tear. I reached out with my free hand to rub my eyes. They were dry and gritty. They were burned by the salt of the tears I had shed while the world was dark. I thought I had been a ghost. I thought I had been a shadow moving through the wreckage of my own heart. I thought I had been suffering without a witness. I looked down at her pale, elegant face. Her eyelashes fluttered like the wings of a trapped bird. She didn't wake up with a start. She didn't gasp. She simply opened her eyes and looked directly at me. They weren't the eyes of someone coming back from a dream. They were wide. They were clear. They were heavy with a truth I wasn't ready to face. "The sun is up, Elle," I whispered. My voice sounded like gravel grinding on stone. "They're clearing the tracks." She didn't move her head from my shoulder. She stayed exactly where she was. She was anchored to me. "I know," she said. Her voice wasn't thick with sleep. It was steady. It was terrifyingly alert. "Arthur," she whispered. I wasn't really sleeping. The air in my lungs seemed to freeze solid. I looked at her. My heart began hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was the sound of a man caught in a lie of pride. "What do you mean?" I asked. My voice trembled. She finally sat up. She smoothed her hair back with a hand that didn't shake. She looked regal even in a drafty, frozen rail car. "I heard the wind," she said softly. "I heard the men in the next car arguing about the remaining coal, but mostly, Arthur, I heard you." I tried to pull the mask back on. The mask of the stoic husband, the provider, the man of iron. It was a mask I had worn since the day we buried Sarah beneath the willow tree. It was made of pride and the false idea of dignity. "I was just talking to pass the time, Elle." I looked at the floorboards. "The darkness makes a man say things he doesn't mean." She reached out. She placed her warm palm against my frozen cheek. The contrast was a shock to my system. "You cried, Arthur." Her voice was a gentle blade. "You cried for 20 minutes when the lamp went out. You told me you were sorry for selling your father's silver watch. The watch I had pawned to buy our passage west. The watch that had been my father's only legacy. You told me you felt like you were leading me into a grave. You said the West was just a beautiful lie you told to keep me moving." I looked away. I couldn't meet the fierce tenderness in her gaze. The shame was a hot, sudden brand on my soul. In 1888, a man was supposed to be the walls of the house. He was the timber. He was the stone. He wasn't supposed to let the roof leak. He wasn't supposed to show the cracks in the foundation. "I didn't want you to hear that," I choked out. The words felt like stones in my throat. "I wanted you to have peace for just a few hours. I wanted to be the one who carried the weight while you rested. I wanted to be your strength, Eleanor." She let out a small, sad laugh. It was a sound that broke my heart into 1,000 smaller pieces. "Oh, Arthur. You foolish, brave man." She leaned closer. The scent of her faint lavender and wood smoke filled my senses. "Do you really think I don't know the shape of your grief by now? Do you think I haven't felt the bed shake when you sobbed into your pillow? Do you think I haven't seen you clench your jaw every time we see a child in the street?" She forced me to look at her. She took my chin in her hand. "Well, I stayed still because I knew you needed to let it out. If I had opened my eyes, you would have stopped. You would have pulled that iron curtain back down. You would have become the provider again. Instead of the man I love, I felt the first sob rise in my throat. It was a jagged thing. I couldn't swallow it this time. I'm supposed to take us to the West and make everything right. I'm supposed to find the justice for what we lost. She shook her head. Her fingers traced the deep lines of exhaustion around my eyes. You were my strength, Arthur, but not by being a rock. Rocks break under enough pressure. You were my strength because you let me lean on you while your own heart was shattering. I stayed on your shoulder to keep you upright. I knew if I moved, if I pulled away, the cold would finally get to your soul. I wasn't resting on you, say. I was holding you together. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. All night, I thought I was the protector. I thought I was the lone sentry guarding the flame. I thought I was the one sacrificing my sleep and my sanity for her. But she had been the one keeping the watch. She had been the one enduring my confessions. She had been the one carrying the man who was carrying the world. That was the true philosophy of the West. It wasn't about the land, it wasn't about the gold or the timber. It was about the quiet, invisible sacrifice of two people refusing to let go. It was the dignity of being vulnerable, the courage to be broken in front of the one you love. The shovels outside hit the side of the train with a metallic clang. The engine let out a sharp, triumphant hiss of steam. The car jolted, just a fraction of an inch, but we were moving. We're going to make it, I whispered. I gripped her hand. My fingers were rough and scarred from years of labor. Hers were small, but they held the strength of a gale. We're going to plant that tree, she said, and we're going to name the first apple after him. I leaned forward and kissed her forehead. It was a vow. It was a prayer. It was a romantic surrender to the truth. Justice wasn't something you found in a court or a law book. Justice was building a life so beautiful that the pain of the past became a sacred memory instead of a curse. Dignity was the act of standing back up, hand in hand, in the middle of a blizzard. I thought I was the guardian of her slumber. In reality, she had been the one on watch. She had performed a miracle of endurance, pretending to be small so I could feel big. She had let me confess my sins to the dark so I wouldn't have to carry them into the light. The train gave a sudden, violent lurch. The floorboards groaned. A low, guttural hiss of steam erupted from beneath us. Life was returning to the machine. We're moving, I whispered. She took both of my hands in hers. She looked at the calluses and the scars. She looked at the space where my father's watch used to sit. We are, she said, but we aren't leaving anything behind anymore. Arthur, the secrets are gone. The silence is finished. She reached into her pocket and touched the small envelope containing the golden curl. You promised him an apple tree, she said. I heard that, too. I heard you promise that the blossoms would fall like snow that doesn't bite. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, the shame finally beginning to evaporate. It was replaced by a strange, hollowed-out lightness, the kind of feeling you get after a fever finally breaks in the middle of the night. I meant it, I said. I know you did, and I'm going to help you plant it. I'm going to help you dig the hole and carry the water, because I'm not just the woman you're taking to Dakota Territory, but Arthur. I'm your partner, and I'm done letting you pretend you're doing this alone. The train began to crawl forward, inch by painful inch. The snow shrieked as the iron wheels ground against the ice. I looked out the window. The world was a blinding, brilliant white under the rising sun. The drifts were massive, like frozen waves of a dead sea. But there were paths being cut through them. Black lines of dirt and ash marked the way forward. I leaned my head back against the hard wooden seat. For the first time in a year, my neck didn't feel like it was made of stone. You're a better liar than I am, Eleanor, she smiled, and for a second, the gaunt shadows under her eyes seemed to vanish. I had to be. You're a very stubborn man to take care of. I reached out and pulled her closer, not as a father protects a child, but as two trees lean against each other in a storm. The hierarchy of our marriage had shifted in the dark. The man of the house had been dismantled and rebuilt. I realized that my greatest failure wasn't the loss of the watch or the death of our daughter. My greatest failure was thinking I had to hide my humanity to be a husband. Are you tired? I asked. She rested her head back on my shoulder, but this time her eyes stayed open. Exhausted, she admitted, but the air feels different now, doesn't it? It did. The smell of coal smoke and wet wool was still there. The chill still sat in the corners of the carriage. But the suffocating weight of the unsaid had lifted. We weren't just passengers on a stalled train anymore. We were a family again, a family of two, carrying a ghost, heading toward a hill we hadn't seen yet. The engine let out a long, triumphant whistle. It echoed across the white valley, sounding like a challenge to the winter. I watched the landscape begin to slide past, trees heavy with ice, cottages buried to the eaves. It was a beautiful, brutal world. Arthur, yes, Elle, don't ever try to be quiet for me again. I want to hear it all. The crying, the praying, the cursing. I want the man, not the statue. I squeezed her hand until my knuckles turned white. You have him, I said. I promise. We sat there in the growing gold of the morning. The train picked up speed. The rhythm of the tracks became a heartbeat. The past was a frozen country behind us. The future was a white page waiting for the first mark. I looked at Eleanor, and for the first time since New York, I saw the girl I had married in the spring. She wasn't sleeping. She was wide awake, watching the world begin again. And as the train cleared the last of the drifts, I felt the warmth return to my shoulder. It wasn't the warmth of the sun. It was the heat of a woman who had saved my life by simply refusing to close her eyes. We were moving. We were really moving. And the apple blossoms felt closer than they ever had before. The iron wheels screamed one last time against the frozen rail. The rhythm of the journey died into a heavy, hissing silence. Outside the frost-etched glass, the station sign emerged from the mist, Willow Creek. It was a small, lonely platform of weathered wood. Piles of snow stood like sentinels along the track. We were the only ones getting off here. I stood up, my joints cracking like dry kindling. Eleanor reached for her satchel, her fingers still stiff from the long night. Wait, I said. The word was quiet, but it stopped her mid-motion. I felt the weight of the small object in my vest pocket. It had been there for 3 weeks. A secret that had cost me more than just money. I pulled it out. It was a small scrap of red flannel, folded neatly and tied with a bit of twine. I took her hand. Her palm was cold, the skin mapped with the faint scars of her labor. I saw you struggling with the old one, I whispered. Back in Pennsylvania, when the light was low. I saw you trying to sharpen that bone needle against the hearthstone. She looked at the small bundle in her hand, her brow furrowing. She carefully untied the twine. Inside, pinned to the flannel, sat a sliver of yellow light. It was a sewing needle, cast in solid gold. It was small, delicate, and perfectly formed. It didn't bend like bone or rust like cheap iron. Eleanor gasped, a soft sound that was lost in the roar of the steam outside. She didn't touch it at first. She just stared at it as if it were a holy relic. Arthur, she breathed. This is too much. I looked at her, really looked at her. I didn't just find the money. Elle, I skipped the midday meals at the lumberyard for 2 months. I told you I wasn't hungry because the work was too fast. But I was thinking of your hands. I was thinking of how many times you pricked your fingers because the old needle was blunt. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the soot on her cheek. She touched the gold with the tip of her finger. It was a tool, but it was also a promise. You kept us together with bone and thread, I said. I want you to build our new life with something that won't break. She closed her hand over the needle. She pulled my hand to her lips and kissed my palm. The salt of her tear was the most sacred thing I had ever tasted. I will, she whispered. I'll sew the stars together if it keeps you warm. The conductor's voice boomed outside, calling out the stop. The reality of the cold rushed in as the door at the end of the car swung open. We stepped out onto the platform. The air was so sharp it felt like breathing glass. But the sky was a deep, impossible blue. I looked at the horizon where the Dakota hills rolled beneath the winter sky. The great storm of '88 had tried to bury us. It had tried to freeze our hearts and stop our blood. But it had failed. Because dignity isn't found in a bank account or a gold watch. It's found in the man who skips a meal to honor his wife's hands. It's found in the woman who watches while her husband sleeps. It's found in the courage to speak when the world demands silence. We walked toward the edge of the platform. The snow crunched under our boots. Two people. One golden needle, a pocket full of promises, and a whole world of light. The wind picked up, swirling the loose powder around our legs. I felt Eleanor's shoulder brush mine. She wasn't leaning for support. She was walking in step. The journey hadn't just changed our destination, it had changed our souls. We were no longer survivors of a tragedy. We were architects of a future. I looked at the small, red-wrapped needle in her hand one last time. It was more than gold. It was the justice I owed her for every silent hour she endured. It was the price of a love that had been refined in the furnace of loss. "Ready?" I asked. She looked at me, her eyes bright and fierce. "Always," she said. We stepped off the platform and into the snow. The path was deep, the wind was cold, but for the first time in our lives, we weren't afraid of the winter. We carried the sun inside us. The iron wheels of the train began to turn again behind us. The whistle blew one final time, a lonely sound in the vast white space. We didn't look back. We kept our eyes on the hills. The gold needle caught a stray beam of light and flashed. It looked like a spark. It looked like the beginning of a fire that would never go out. We walked on. The silence of the plains was no longer a threat. It was a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, we began to build our home, brick by brick, stitch by stitch, breath by breath, finally, truly free. The snow continued to glitter like diamonds under our feet. Each step was a victory. Each breath was a prayer. We were a living testament to the fact that love is not a feeling. Love is a decision made in the middle of a blizzard. It is the choice to stay awake when the world is freezing. It is the choice to share the last of the warmth. I looked at Eleanor as we reached the tree line. She looked beautiful, not the fragile beauty of a flower, but the enduring beauty of the earth itself. She was my wife. She was my partner. She was my conscience. And as the first green branch of a pine tree brushed my arm, I knew the apple trees would grow, the blossoms would fall, and we would be there to see it. Together, in the light, in the peace, in the love that survives everything. The world was wide and white and waiting, and we were ready to write our names upon it. The gold needle was safe in her hand. The promise was safe in my heart, and the ghosts were finally at rest. The morning sun climbed higher, chasing the last of the shadows away. We walked into the new day, two halves of a soul finally made whole. The winter was over, the spring was coming, and for the first time we had all the time in the world. The end of the old life was just the beginning of the true one, and it was more than enough. It was everything. We reached the small cabin at the edge of the wood. Smoke curled from a neighbor's chimney in the distance. I turned to Eleanor. She looked at the small house, then back at me. "We're here," she said. "Yes," but I replied, "Wow, we're home." The door creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside was stale, but it was dry. It was a start. I set our bags down on the rough floor. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, framed by the white world outside. "Go." She looked like a painting of hope. I reached out and took her hand. We stood there for a long time, just breathing the same air. The storm was a memory. The future was a reality. And we were the masters of our own fate. The needle, the curl, and the man, the strength, the grace, and the woman. A new story was starting, and it was going to be beautiful. The sun hit the floorboards, turning the dust into gold. Everything was golden. Everything was right. Finally, the gold needle was a silent promise. It was a vow that she would never have to mend our lives with broken things again. I watched her thumb trace the cool, polished metal. Her skin was mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 sleepless nights in the city. "You went hungry for this?" she asked. Her voice was a soft tremor in the quiet cabin. "I'd go through a winter of famine to see you smile like that," I replied. I meant every word. The hunger had been a hollow companion for months. It was a gnawing ghost that followed me through the soot-stained streets of New York. I had skipped meals while the great blizzard of 1888 howled outside our tenement window. That storm had buried the city in 20 feet of snow. It had frozen the breath of the poor and silenced the heartbeat of commerce. But I had held on to a single vision. I saw Eleanor sitting in a patch of real sunlight, sewing something that wasn't a shroud or a rag. She didn't thank me with words. She simply leaned in. She pressed her forehead against mine. It was the touch of a survivor. The gold needle caught the pale New England sun as it broke through the lingering clouds. It glittered with a fierce, stubborn defiance. It was a small defiance against a world that wanted us to stay small. "Now," I said, my voice finally steady. The weight of the journey was beginning to settle into my bones. The iron tracks were miles behind us. I remembered the moment the train had finally stopped at the Whistletop station. The conductor had opened the heavy iron door with a grunt of effort. A blast of air had hit us. It smelled of pine needles and ancient ice. It was the kind of cold that didn't bite. It woke the blood. I stepped onto the platform first. I reached back for her. Her hand was small in mine. Her grip was like iron. We stood on that wooden platform as the train began to pull away. The black smoke billowed into the blue sky. It left us behind in a world that was vast, white, and terrifyingly silent. Eleanor had tucked the gold needle safely into the bodice of her dress. She kept it right against her heart. She looked toward the tree line. A narrow path had been shoveled through the drifts. "Which way?" "Arthur," she had asked. I pointed toward the rising slope of the hill. "Up there, past the creek. The house is small, but the dirt is good." She took a deep breath. The cold air filled her lungs. She didn't look back at the train. She didn't look back at the life we had left in the soot and the shadows. She looked at the snow. She saw the garden we hadn't planted yet. She saw the apple trees. She saw a life where her hands would create beauty instead of just fighting for survival. We started walking. Our boots made a rhythmic crunch in the fresh powder. It was the heartbeat of a new beginning. The gold was hidden, but I knew it was there. It was a tiny, unbreakable anchor. We weren't just two people lost in the wilderness anymore. We were a man and a woman with the right tools to build something that would last. The sun climbed higher. It turned the snow into a field of diamonds. Eleanor squeezed my hand. "Arthur." "Yes, Elle. I think I'm going to make something beautiful with that needle." "I know you are," I said. We kept walking, leaving a single set of tracks in the pristine white. The path was narrow. It wound through a stand of sleeping birches. The world felt like it had been held under a spell of white. I carried the weight of our battered trunks. They were light, filled mostly with memories and a few changes of clothes. But my heart felt lighter than it had in years. Beside me, Eleanor walked with a steady grace. She wasn't looking at the ground, she was looking at the horizon. The cabin was waiting. It sat nestled against the shoulder of the hill. Smoke wasn't rising from the chimney yet. The windows were dark, but it was standing. It was ours. We stopped at the edge of the clearing. The air was so still you could hear the frost crack on the bark of the trees. I looked at the woman who had stood by me for 1,000 miles. I looked at the woman who had heard my secrets in the dark of a crowded train car and chosen to stay. Marriage is often described as a contract in the city. They call it a partnership of convenience or a social necessity. But here, in the cold light of the frontier, I know better. It is a long, quiet sacrifice. It is the silver watch you sell so she can sleep without a growling stomach. It is the gold needle she carries to keep your dreams from fraying at the edges. It is the silence you keep when words would only serve to hurt. And it is the truth you finally tell when the world stops moving and the noise fades away. We made it through the storm of 1888. Many didn't. The paper said the drifts reached the second stories of houses in Manhattan. They said people were found frozen just steps from their own front doors. We survived because we stopped hiding our wounds from each other. Eleanor reached out now, back in the present of our small room. She brushed a stray flake of melting snow from my coat. Her touch was warm. Her eyes were clear. I look at her, and I see every mile we traveled. Every sacrifice, every whispered promise in the dark of a tenement hallway. Love isn't the roaring fire at the start of the journey. It's the coal that stays hot when the winter settles in for the long haul. It is the willingness to be the one who doesn't move when the wind screams. It is the strength to be the one who catches the book before it hits the floor. I realized then that we didn't just find a house. We found the courage to be seen by one another. Truly seen. What about you? What is the quietest sacrifice you've ever made for the person you love? Have you ever given up a piece of your soul just to keep their heart beating a little faster? Or perhaps, what was the moment you realized someone was carrying a heavy burden for you in the dark? Maybe they never told you. Maybe they just leaned in and pressed their forehead against yours. Tell me your story. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single word you write. I want to know the names of the people who stayed when your world got cold. I want to hear about the gold needles in your own lives. We are safe now. The house is waiting to be filled with the scent of pine and baking bread. The future is a needle and thread. For the first time, the future no longer feels as though it might snap under the pressure.